The Duke's handmaid who stole his heart. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The corridors of Ravenshire Manor were not merely hallways. They were arteries of stone and shadow, pulsing with the silent, terrified life of those who served. For Clara, tonight those arteries felt like the throat of a beast closing in. The heavy oak floorboards, polished to a mirror sheen by her own raw hands just that morning, offered no friction to her fleeing soles as she skidded around the corner of the servants' passage. Her breathing was a ragged staccato, a harsh counterpoint to the distant, muffled swells of violins drifting down from the grand ballroom. Upstairs, the nobility danced in a sea of silk and powdered wigs, oblivious to the desperation unspooling beneath their feet. Down here, amidst the scent of beeswax and damp stone, Clara was being hunted. She dared not look back. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Lord Harrington's boots against the timber floor was a sufficient herald of his proximity. He was a guest of the Duke, a man of influential standing and grotesque appetites, who had cornered her in the linen closet with hands that grasped like wet clay. She had struck him an instinctive, terrified slap that had surely signed her death warrant if she were caught, and fled. Now, panic was a cold iron band tightening around her chest. To return to the servants' quarters was to lead him to her sanctuary. To run to the kitchens was to expose her shame to the gossip of the staff. There was only one place where a man like Harrington might hesitate to tread, one domain of silence in a house of noise. The West Wing, the Duke's private quarters. It was strictly forbidden territory. The housekeeper, Mrs. Weaver, had warned them all in whispered, fearful tones that the Duke of Ravenshire was not to be disturbed when he retreated to his study. He was a man consumed by mourning, they said, a brooding force of nature who wore his grief like armor. But the fear of the Duke was abstract, a ghost story told by candlelight, whereas the fear of Lord Harrington was visceral and hot on her heels. Clara pushed through the heavy baize door that separated the service wing from the family's private sanctum, the sound of the latch clicking shut behind her echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, oppressive silence. Here the air was different. It smelled of leather, old paper, and the faint, biting aroma of sandalwood. The corridor was dim, lit only by the moonlight spilling through tall, uncurtained windows. Clara pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving beneath her starch-stiffened apron. She waited, eyes squeezed shut, listening for the pursuit. Footsteps approached the door she had just passed, slowed, and then stopped. A handle rattled. A curse was muttered, low and venomous, before the footsteps retreated. The relief was so profound it nearly buckled her knees, but she knew she could not remain in the hallway. If a footman or the valet passed, she would be discovered. She slipped into the nearest room, the massive double doors moving on well-oiled hinges that made no sound. The library was a cavern of shadows. Walls of books stretched up to a ceiling lost in darkness, and a massive fireplace dominated the far wall. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a dull, blood-red light across the Persian rugs and heavy velvet drapes. Clara leaned back against the door, closing her eyes, allowing the adrenaline to ebb away into a trembling exhaustion. She was safe. For a moment, she was safe. She reached up to adjust her mob cap, which had slipped askew in her flight, her fingers brushing against the chestnut strands of hair that had escaped their pins. "I was under the impression," a voice resonated from the darkness, deep and smooth as tumbling stones, "that the staff had strict instructions regarding this wing." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs, the sound loud enough that she feared he could hear it. She froze, her eyes snapping open and straining against the gloom. In a high-backed leather wing chair facing the hearth, a figure moved. The silhouette was imposing, broad-shouldered and still. As he leaned forward, the dying light of the fire caught the sharp angle of a jawline and the glint of a silver signet ring on a hand gripping a tumbler of amber liquid. It was Arthur, the Duke of Ravenshire. He did not turn to look at her. He remained staring into the embers, his profile cut from granite, radiating a terrifying stillness. He was in his shirt-sleeves, his black morning coat discarded on a nearby ottoman, his cravat loosened, a state of undress that made the intrusion feel infinitely more intimate and dangerous. Clara's mind raced, searching for an excuse, a reason, anything to explain her presence that did not involve admitting she had assaulted a guest. Servants were dismissed for less. For striking a peer, she could be arrested. She swallowed the dry lump of terror in her throat and dropped into a deep, shaky curtsy, though he was not looking at her. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. I beg your pardon, I did not know you were within." "That does not explain why you are within," he replied, his tone devoid of anger but heavy with an exhausting authority. He took a slow sip of his drink. "Speak, girl, or leave, though I imagine you have a reason for bursting into my sanctuary as if the hounds of hell were nipping at your heels." "The fire, your grace," Clara lied, the falsehood slipping out before she could weigh its merit. It was a desperate, foolish thing to say. I was sent to tend the fire, to ensure the embers did not die out completely before the morning." Slowly, agonizingly, the Duke turned his head. The movement was predatory in its grace. For the first time, Clara saw his face clearly. He was a man in his mid-30s, though the shadows beneath his eyes spoke of a weariness that aged him. His hair was dark, swept back from a high forehead, and his eyes were piercingly cold, dark pools that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He looked at the fireplace where a veritable mountain of heat still pulsed, enough to warm the room for hours, and then he looked back at her. His gaze traveled over her flustered appearance, the chaotic state of her usually pristine uniform, and the way her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. "You are a terrible liar," he said softly. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. She lowered her gaze to the floor, her hands twisting into the fabric of her apron. "Your Grace." "The fire is adequate," he interrupted, placing his glass on the side table with a decisive clink. "And the household staff knows that I tend to my own hearth when I am in residence here. Furthermore, you are out of breath, your cap is askew, and you are trembling. Maids sent to stoke embers do not typically look as though they have survived a war." He stood up. The action sucked the air out of the room. He was taller than she had imagined, a towering figure of broad chest and long limbs. He moved toward her, not with haste, but with the inevitable momentum of a tide. Clara shrank back against the door, her hand fumbling behind her for the handle, panic flaring anew. "Please, your Grace," she gasped, her facade crumbling. "I will leave. I meant no intrusion. Please do not dismiss me." "Stop," he commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the word carried the weight of a gavel strike. He stopped 3 paces from her, looming in the dim light. He studied her face, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He looked at her not as a piece of furniture, as most of the nobility did, but as a puzzle. "You are afraid, and not of me, not initially." Clara remained silent, her eyes wide, the color of autumn honey catching a flicker of the firelight. She bit her lip to stop it from quivering. "Who is it?" he asked. The question was simple, but the edge in his voice had sharpened. "Who chased you here?" "No one, your Grace," she whispered, looking down. "I merely—" "Do not insult my intelligence a second time," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low rumble in the quiet room. "You bolted the door to the service wing. I heard the latch. You are hiding. Now tell me who you are hiding from, or I shall ring the bell and have the steward drag you out." The threat of the steward broke her resolve. The steward would ask no questions, he would simply throw her out into the cold night, and she had nowhere to go. Her father's debts were a noose waiting to tighten. She needed this position. She needed the walls of Ravenshire. "Lord Harrington," she confessed, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. She did not look up. He cornered me in the linen closet. I fled." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching out until the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to thunder. Arthur did not move, but the air around him seemed to grow colder. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He knew Harrington. He knew the man's reputation, a reputation that was often laughed off in the gentlemen's clubs as high spirits, but which Arthur found detestable. "Did he touch you?" Arthur asked. The question was clinical, yet beneath it lay a dangerous current. "He tried, your Grace," Clara said, her voice barely audible. I struck him." Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly. "You struck a peer of the realm." "I had no choice," she said, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest despite her fear. She looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time with unwavering intensity. "I am a servant, your Grace, not a chaotic for his amusement. I would do it again." For a long moment the Duke stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, a sharp intelligence and dignity that seemed at odds with her rough hands and linen cap. Most women in her position would be weeping, begging for forgiveness, or hysterically denying the event. She stood there, terrified but unbroken, admitting to an act that could see her imprisoned and defending her right to her own person. Something behind the Duke's cold exterior fractured, a crack in the ice. "He will be waiting," Arthur said, turning away from her to pace toward the window. He looked out over the moonlit gardens, his hands clasped behind his back. "Harrington is a petty man. He will wait for you to emerge, or he will complain to the housekeeper that you were insolent, ensuring your dismissal to punish you." "I know," Clara replied, the hopelessness of her situation settling over her shoulders. "I will gather my things and leave before dawn, your Grace. I will not bring scandal to your house." You will do no such thing, Arthur said, turning back to face her. The shadows obscured his expression, but his voice was absolute. You will remain in this room until I say otherwise. Clara blinked, confused. Your Grace. You cannot go back out there tonight, he stated, walking back to his chair and retrieving his glass. And I will not have it said that I allowed a guest to terrorize my household. You will stay here. There is a settee in the alcove. You may sleep there. Sleep here? Clara's scandalized whisper filled the room. In your study, with you, Your Grace, the impropriety if anyone were to find out. Would you prefer Harrington? He cut her off, his tone dry. Clara fell silent. The choice was between a man who had hunted her like prey and a man who, despite his intimidating power and the vast social chasm between them, was offering her a strange, cold sanctuary. I thank you, Your Grace, she murmured. Arthur sat back down, turning his profile to her once more, effectively dismissing her presence. Do not thank me and do not speak. I require silence to think. Go to the alcove, stay out of sight. Clara moved quietly to the shadowed alcove he had indicated. It was tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain containing a modest velvet sofa. She sat on the edge of it, her hands clasped in her lap, her heart still racing but the immediate panic subsiding into a confusing warmth. She watched him from the shadows. He sat alone in the vast room, surrounded by wealth and power, yet looking utterly, devastatingly isolated. She had lied to him and he had protected her. She had struck a nobleman and he had not condemned her. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside the stone walls of Ravenshire, Clara realized with a jolt of trepidation that the dangerous man in the chair frightened her far less than the sudden, treacherous pull she felt toward him. For the first time in years, Arthur, Duke of Ravenshire, was not thinking of his dead wife or his failing bills. He was thinking of the honey-eyed girl with the rough hands who had the audacity to lie to a duke and the courage to slap a lord. He took a sip of his whiskey, the burn indistinguishable from the sudden, unfamiliar spark of interest flaring in his chest. The door was locked, the world was shut out, and for tonight, the hierarchy of Ravenshire Manor was suspended in the amber light of the dying fire. The dawn broke over Ravenshire Manor not with the golden promise of a new day, but with a gray, steely light that seemed to press against the window panes, demanding entry. For Clara, the transition from the terrifying sanctuary of the Duke's study back to the regimented world of the servants' quarters had been a blur of shadowed corridors and held breath. She had expected immediate dismissal. She had waited for the summons to Mrs. Weaver's office, anticipating the cold pronouncement that she was to pack her meager belongings and leave. Instead, the summons that came 2 days later was of an entirely different nature, one that sent a ripple of bewildered whispering through the scullery maids and footmen alike. Mrs. Weaver, a woman whose face appeared to be carved from dried apple and disapproval, had looked at Clara over the rim of her spectacles with a mixture of suspicion and reluctance. The instructions were precise and peculiar. Clara was relieved of her duties in the laundry and the guest corridors. She was effectively immediately assigned to the West Wing as the private attendant to the Duke's library and archives. It was a promotion that made no sense for a maid of her station, a singularity that marked her out as a target for envy, yet it was an order from the Duke himself, and in Ravenshire the Duke's word was not merely law, it was theology. The library became her world. It was a vast, high-ceilinged kingdom of dust and vellum, smelling of dried ink and the slow decay of centuries. Her duties were ostensibly to clean and organize, to battle the entropy that had overtaken Arthur's workspace since the death of the Duchess. But as the days turned into a week, Clara realized her true purpose was simply to be where he could see her. She was a bird in a gilded cage, placed there not for her song, but so the predator could ensure no other beast could reach her. Arthur spent his mornings and late evenings there, working at the massive mahogany desk that looked like a fortress barricade. He was a man of dark moods and long silences, scratching away at correspondence with a quill that seemed ready to snap under the pressure of his grip. At first, they did not speak. The silence between them was thick, a living thing that expanded to fill the room. Clara would move softly along the shelves, cataloging titles and dusting spines, acutely aware of his eyes tracking her movement. It was not the leering gaze of Lord Harrington which felt like oil sliding over her skin. Arthur's gaze was heavy, physical, like the touch of a warm hand on the small of her back. It made her clumsy. It made her burn. One rainy afternoon, the tension that had been simmering finally boiled over, catalyzed by the chaos of his desk. Arthur had been searching for a specific land deed for the better part of an hour, his frustration mounting until he swept a stack of ledgers onto the floor with a roar of exasperation. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. Clara, who had been on a ladder repairing a binding, froze. She watched as he buried his face in his hands, the posture of a man carrying a weight too heavy for human shoulders. Slowly, she descended the ladder. Caution warned her to stay back to let the storm pass, but the pull she felt toward him, the strange magnetic tether that had formed the night he saved her, drew her forward. She knelt amidst the scattered papers, her hands moving with the swift, practiced efficiency of someone who found comfort in order. She did not look at him, but she could feel his attention shift, the heat of his anger cooling into a sharp, focused curiosity. "The deed for the tenant farms in Derbyshire is not in the ledgers, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the drumming of the rain against the glass. "It was filed within the correspondence from your solicitor, bound in the blue ribbon. I placed it in the second drawer atop the letters from the Admiralty." Arthur lowered his hands. He looked at the top of her linen cap, then down to her hands as they deftly restacked the heavy books. "You read my correspondence?" Clara paused, a flush rising on her neck. I only glanced at the headers, Your Grace, to ensure they were filed by date and subject. The chaos, it seemed to distress you." "And you thought to remedy it?" He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "Most maids would not know the difference between a land deed and a laundry list, yet you organize my estate with the precision of a clerk." Clara stood up, smoothing her apron, her eyes finally meeting his. The distance between them was negligible, separated only by the corner of the desk. "I was taught to read, Your Grace, and I have found that order brings clarity. When the world is messy, a tidy desk is a small mercy." Arthur studied her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to decipher a script written in a dead language. He saw the intelligence she tried so hard to hide beneath the veneer of servitude. He saw the way she held herself, not with the slouch of exhaustion, but with the rigid grace of someone maintaining a disguise. "A small mercy," he repeated, the words rolling around his mouth. He stood up, and instinctively Clara took a step back. He stopped, respecting the retreat but not the boundary. "You are a curiosity, Clara. You scrub floors and haul water, yet you speak with the cadence of a governess and organize legal documents better than my own steward. Who are you?" "I am your handmaid, Your Grace," she deflected, her heart hammering against her ribs. The secret of her past was a dangerous thing. If he knew her father was a disgraced gentleman, a gambler who had ruined them, the pity might turn to disdain. Or worse, he might send her away to avoid the complication of a fallen woman in his house. And I should return to my work. "You are safe here," he said, ignoring her deflection. His voice dropped, losing its interrogative edge and gaining a dark, velvety texture. "You understand that, do you not? I moved you here so that you would be under my eye, under my protection." "I know," she whispered. The admission hung in the air, fragile and terrifying, "but I am not sure if I am safe from you." The boldness of the statement shocked them both. Arthur stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the sandalwood soap he used and the faint, smoky scent of brandy. He reached out, his fingers hovering for a second before brushing a stray lock of hair away from her forehead. The touch was electric, scorching a path down her spine. His knuckles grazed her temple, rough skin against soft, a contrast that made her breath hitch. "You are right to question it," he murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips. "I am not a safe man, Clara. I am a man who takes what he wants, and I find myself wanting things I should not." Before the moment could spiral into the inevitable, the heavy oak doors of the library creaked open. The spell shattered. Clara jumped back as if scalded, turning to busy herself with a stack of books. Arthur straightened, his face instantly hardening into the mask of the indifferent aristocrat. It was the footman delivering the afternoon post, oblivious to the fact that he had walked in on the precipice of ruin. But the bubble of the library could not last forever. The manor was vast, and Clara's duties, though centered in the West Wing, occasionally required her to venture into the belly of the beast. 3 days later, the supply of beeswax for the library floor ran out, and Mrs. Weaver was nowhere to be found to dispatch a lower maid. Clara, emboldened by a week of relative peace, took the back stairs down to the storerooms near the kitchens. The house was busy with preparations for a hunt the following morning. The corridors smelled of roasting game and damp wool. Clara moved quickly, keeping her head down, clutching the jar of wax to her chest like a shield. She had almost made it back to the safety of the baize door when a shadow detached itself from the alcove near the gunroom. "The little mouse emerges from her hole," a voice sneered, thick with wine and malice. Clara's blood ran cold. Lord Harrington blocked her path, leaning casually against the doorframe, picking his teeth with a silver toothpick. He looked disheveled, his wig slightly askew, his eyes bright with the glazed look of a man who had been drinking since breakfast. He had not forgotten the slap. His ego, bruised and festering, had been waiting for this moment. "My lord," Clara said, dipping into a curtsy that was more a defensive crouch. She tried to sidestep him. "I must return to my duties. The Duke is expecting me." "The Duke?" Harrington laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He pushed off the wall, moving with surprising speed to grab her upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh through the sleeve of her dress. "Ravenshire keeps you locked up in that tower like a prized mare. Does he sample the goods, girl? Is that why you think you're too good for me?" "Let me go," Clara hissed, struggling against his grip. The jar of wax fell from her hands, shattering on the stone floor, the sound sharp and shocking. "Touch me again and I will scream. The Duke will hear me." "The Duke doesn't care about a servant slut," Harrington snarled, his face twisting with rage. He yanked her closer, his breath hot and sour on her face. "He's playing a game, but I don't play games. You owe me a debt for the insult you gave me, and I intend to collect." He dragged her backward towards the open door of the gun room. Panic, white and blinding, seized Clara. She kicked out, her boot connecting with his shin, but he was too heavy, too drunk on entitlement to be stopped by pain. She opened her mouth to scream, but his hand clamped over it, tasting of salt and leather. "Silence," he grunted, forcing her back against a display case of muskets. "You will learn your place." "Her place," a voice thundered from the end of the corridor, "is nowhere near you." Harrington froze. The hand over Clara's mouth loosened just enough for her to gasp for air. They both looked up. Arthur stood at the top of the short flight of stairs leading to the main hall. He was not shouting. He was not moving. He stood with a stillness that was far more terrifying than any frenzy of violence. He was dressed for riding, a whip coiled loosely in his right hand, his silhouette framed by the light from the hall behind him like an avenging angel cast in shadow. "Ravenshire," Harrington stammered, releasing Clara so abruptly she stumbled and fell to her knees amidst the shards of the broken jar. The girl was insolent. I was merely disciplining her." Arthur descended the stairs. Each step was deliberate, a measured beat of approaching doom. He did not look at Harrington. He walked past the lord as if he were a nuisance of mud on a boot and knelt beside Clara. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. The tenderness in his voice was so at odds with the violence radiating from his body that it made Clara sob. "No, Your Grace," she managed to choke out, though her arm throbbed where Harrington had gripped her. "I am fine." Arthur nodded once, then stood up and turned to Harrington. The transformation was instant. The tenderness evaporated, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. He stepped into Harrington's space, towering over the shorter man. "You are a guest in my home," Arthur said, his voice low and deadly smooth. "And yet you hunt my staff as if this were a brothel. You mistake my hospitality for blindness, Harrington." "She's just a maid, Arthur," Harrington scoffed, trying to regain his composure but failing to hide the tremor in his hands. "Don't tell me you've actually developed feelings for the chit. It's beneath you." Arthur moved so fast Clara barely saw it. He didn't strike Harrington with his fist, he simply shoved him. It was a single, brutal exertion of power that sent Harrington staggering back against the stone wall. Arthur followed, pinning the man there with a forearm against his throat, the riding whip dangling inches from Harrington's eye. "Listen to me very carefully," Arthur whispered, the sound like a blade being drawn from a sheath. "She is under my protection. If you look at her again, if you speak to her, if you so much as breathe the same air as her, I will not challenge you to a duel. I will not seek satisfaction as a gentleman. I will destroy you. I will call in every debt you owe, I will expose every vice you hide, and I will leave you destitute in the gutter. Do you understand?" Harrington turned pale, his eyes bulging as he gasped for air against the pressure on his windpipe. He nodded frantically. Arthur held him there for a second longer, letting the terror take root, then released him with a look of utter disgust. "Get out of my sight. Leave my estate within the hour." Harrington scrambled away, coughing and clutching his throat, fleeing up the stairs without a backward glance. The corridor fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of the two people left behind. Arthur turned back to Clara. The rage drained out of him, leaving him looking hollow and shaken. He reached down, offering her his hand. It was trembling slightly. Clara looked at the hand of a duke, a hand that held power over life and death in this county, and took it. He pulled her to her feet, but he didn't let go. He pulled her close, inspecting her face, his eyes searching for bruises. "He didn't," Arthur started, unable to finish the sentence. "No," Clara assured him, her voice steadying. "You came in time." I should have killed him, Arthur said, the dark thoughts spoken aloud. He looked at her, and the barrier of class and station that had separated them for so long seemed to dissolve into dust. I cannot bear the thought of anyone touching you, it drives me to madness. Arthur, she whispered, using his given name for the first time. It hung in the air, a forbidden intimacy. He did not correct her. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to the rough knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. It was a gesture of reverence, not dominance. Come, he said, his voice rough. Let us go back to the library where the world cannot touch us. He led her up the stairs, his grip on her hand tight, possessive. Clara followed him, her heart soaring and sinking in equal measure. She was safe, yes, he had saved her. But as she looked at the broad back of the man leading her into the shadows, she knew the danger had not passed. It had simply changed form. She was no longer prey to a wolf. She was falling in love with the dragon, and that fire would surely consume them both. The tranquility that had settled over the West Wing was a fragile thing, spun from silence and the unspoken understanding between two people who were never meant to exist in the same orbit. For a fortnight, Ravenshire Manor had felt less like a prison and more like a fortress. Lord Harrington had not returned. Rumors in the servants' hall suggested he had fled to the continent to avoid a sudden recall of gambling debts, a coincidence Clara attributed entirely to the man sitting behind the mahogany desk. But the past is a persistent hunter, one that does not require an invitation to enter. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried on the back of a storm that battered the bleak moors surrounding the estate. The rain lashed against the high arched windows of the library, turning the glass into sheets of distorted gray weeping. Inside, the fire roared in defiance, but the warmth could not reach the chill that settled in Clara's marrow when the heavy oak doors groaned open without a knock. It was Mr. Farrow, the steward. His usually impassive face was pinched with a mixture of confusion and distaste. He bowed stiffly to Arthur, who did not look up from the ledger he was annotating. Your Grace, Farrow said, his voice tight. Forgive the intrusion. There is a man in the vestibule. He refuses to leave. He claims he has business of a legal nature that cannot wait. Arthur paused, the quill hovering over the parchment. I have no appointments, Farrow, and if it is a solicitor, he can speak to my man in London. Send him away. I attempted to, Your Grace, Farrow replied, shifting his weight uncomfortably. He cast a quick, unreadable glance toward Clara, who was shelving a volume of botanical prints on the mezzanine ladder. However, he insists his business is not with you directly, but lies within your jurisdiction as the magistrate of this parish. He claims he is here to collect a fugitive. Clara's hand slipped. The heavy book tumbled from her grasp, hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Arthur slowly set down his quill. He turned his head, his eyes finding Clara frozen on the ladder, her face drained of all color. He looked back at Farrow. A fugitive? A Miss Clara Sterling, Farrow said, reading the name from a slip of paper in his hand. He claims she is posing as a servant in this household. The silence that followed was absolute. The name hung in the air, a ghost resurrected. Clara felt the room spin. The linen cap, the apron, the rough hands, all the armor she had constructed to survive stripped away in a single breath. She descended the ladder, her legs trembling so violently she nearly fell. Show him in, Arthur commanded quietly. Your Grace, Clara whispered, stepping forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Please, do not let him in. I will go. I will surrender myself. Arthur stood up. His face was a mask of terrifying neutrality. You will stand right there, Clara. Farrow, show him in. The man who entered moments later was a creature of ink and grease. He wore a coat that had seen better decades, stained with snuff and rain, and carried a leather satchel that bulged with the misery of others. He looked around the grand library with a sneer of envy before his watery eyes landed on Clara. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face, revealing yellowed teeth. Ah, the man crooned, stepping forward. Miss Sterling, or do you prefer Clara now? It is amazing how a mobcap can humble the proud daughter of a gentleman. State your name and your business, Arthur's voice cut through the air, sharp as a lash. He had moved around the desk, placing himself subtly between the intruder and Clara. The man bowed, a mocking, jerky motion. Thaddeus Leach, Your Grace, agent for the Crown's debtors' court. I hold a warrant for the arrest of this woman. I owe no debts, Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. My father's debts were his own. Your father, God rest his irresponsible soul, is dead, Leach said, tapping the side of his nose. And as his sole surviving heir, having failed to renounce the inheritance formally before the window closed, the burden of the Sterling estate falls to you, or rather the burden of its liquidation. You fled London, Miss Sterling, you absconded, that is a crime. He reached into his satchel and produced a folded document, damp from the rain. £3,000, payable immediately, or she comes with me to the Marshalsea until such time as the sum is worked off, which, given the interest, will be never. Arthur took the document. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable. Clara watched him, her heart shattering. She had lied to him again, not by speech but by omission. She had let him believe she was a common girl born to service, when in truth she was the debris of the gentry, a woman who knew how to dance the minuet and speak French, forced to scrub floors to escape the sins of her father. £3,000, Arthur repeated. He looked at Leach with profound boredom. For this, you have tracked a woman across 3 counties and interrupted my afternoon. It is the law, Your Grace, Leach bristled, sensing the dismissal. She is a debtor, she belongs to the crown. She belongs to me, Arthur said. The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of a stone dropping into a deep well. Leach blinked. Clara gasped softly. Arthur walked over to the fireplace. He held the warrant out, dangling it over the flames. The heat curled the edges of the paper. You cannot do that, Leach shrieked, stepping forward. That is an official document. I am the Duke of Ravenshire, Arthur said, not looking at the man. I am the Lord Lieutenant of this county. My word is the law here, and I say that this warrant is invalid due to clerical errors. He dropped the paper. The fire eagerly consumed the debt, the ink bubbling and turning to ash. Arthur turned back to the trembling man. You will go to my solicitor in London tomorrow. He will cut you a check for the principal sum. You will waive the interest and the fees for your trouble. If you ever speak this woman's name again, or if I hear a whisper of her past in the London clubs, I will have you transported for trespassing on peerage land. Do I make myself clear? Leach opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the fire and then at the Duke's cold eyes. He realized he was in the presence of a predator far larger than himself. He nodded frantically, clutched his satchel and scurried out of the room like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. When the door clicked shut, the silence returned, heavier than before. Clara could not look at him. Shame, hot and scorching, burned her cheeks. She turned away, staring at the rain-lashed window, hugging her arms around her waist. I am sorry, she whispered. I should have told you I was ashamed. Ashamed of what? Arthur asked. His voice was closer now. He was standing right behind her. She could feel the heat of him. That your father was a fool, that you were born to silk and forced into linen. That I am a fraud, she cried out, spinning around to face him. Tears spilled over her lashes, hot tracks on her cold skin. You thought you saved a helpless maid. Instead, you have harbored a fugitive, a liar, a woman who allowed you to pay a fortune to clean up her mess. I am no better than the people who attend your balls, pretending to be something they are not. Do you think I care about the money? Arthur snapped, his composure cracking. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard, desperate. Do you think I care about your lineage? I realized you were not born to service the moment I saw you read the titles on these shelves. No maid looks at a library with that kind of hunger, Clara. Then why, she demanded, her voice breaking, why keep me, why pay for me? Because you are the only real thing in this entire accursed house, he roared. The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. Arthur released her, stepping back as if he had revealed too much. He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting the severe grooming, making him look wild. He walked to the window, staring out at the gray, weeping landscape of his estate. Look at this, he gestured vaguely to the room, the manor, the world outside. Everyone sees the Duke, the power, the wealth, they see the armor, even my wife, even Alina. Clara stilled. He never spoke of the Duchess. No one did. She was a perfect match, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a hollow monotone. Beautiful, high-born, we were the envy of the ton, and when she fell ill, the consumption took her so slowly. He laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. Everyone assumes I grieve her. They think I wear this black because my heart is broken. He turned to face Clara, his eyes dark with a torture she had never understood until now. I do not grieve her love, Clara. I grieve my failure. I was the Duke of Ravenshire. I controlled the tenant yields, the political seats, the very flow of water through this valley. But I could not command the fever to leave her blood. I sat by her bed and watched her drown in her own lungs, and I felt, Nothing but anger, anger that I was powerless, anger that I was losing a possession. He looked at his hands, turning them over. I did not love her, and she died knowing it. That is my sin, that is the ghost that haunts this wing, not her spirit but my own coldness. I am a monster of duty, Clara, I am hollow. Clara looked at him, seeing the cracks in the marble facade. He wasn't a god or a king, he was a man crushed by the weight of his own perceived omnipotence. He believed his lack of romantic love for his wife made him a villain when in truth he had been a victim of a marriage made for alliances, not affection. She crossed the distance between them. It was the longest walk of her life. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had just burned her debt, the hand that had held a whip to Harrington's throat. You are not hollow, she said softly. A hollow man would not have saved me. A hollow man would not have noticed a maid trembling in the dark. Arthur looked down at her, his expression shattering. The control he prized so dearly, the restraint that defined his existence, finally snapped. He looked at her not as a problem to be solved or a dependent to be protected, but as the only source of warmth in a winter that had lasted 3 years. Clara, he groaned, the name torn from his throat. He pulled her to him. This time there was no hesitation, no thought of propriety. His mouth crashed down on hers, desperate and starving. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a reclamation. It tasted of brandy and rain and years of suppressed longing. Clara gasped against his lips, her hands rising to tangle in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. He lifted her, sweeping her off her feet as if she weighed nothing, and sat her on the edge of the heavy oak desk, scattering the remaining papers. The ledgers, the deeds, the endless demands of the dukedom, they were pushed aside for the reality of her skin, her breath, her pulse jumping beneath his fingers. Arthur, she breathed, pulling back slightly to look him in the eye. If we do this, if we cross this line. There is no line, he murmured, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. There is only this. I have spent my life doing what is right, what is expected. Tonight I will be selfish. He kissed the hollow of her throat, his hands moving to the strings of her apron. The symbol of her servitude fell away, pooling on the floor. Outside, the storm raged against the stone walls of the manor, the wind howling like the chorus of society that would surely condemn them. But in the firelit sanctuary of the library, amidst the scent of old books and burning wood, the Duke and the Handmaid stripped away the titles and the lies. They came together with a fierce, frantic intensity, a collision of two lonely souls finding purchase in the dark. There was no grace in it, only need. When he finally claimed her, pressing her back against the cool leather of the desk, Clara cried out not in pain but in the shattering relief of finally being seen, of finally belonging to someone who wanted her not for her name or her service, but for the fire in her blood. Later, as the fire died down to embers and the rain softened to a steady rhythm against the glass, they lay tangled together on the rug before the hearth, wrapped in his heavy velvet morning coat. Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. Arthur ran his hand down the length of her arm, his fingers tracing the scars of her labor. You cannot stay in the servants' quarters, he said quietly, his voice rumbling through his chest. Not after this. I cannot be the Duchess, Clara whispered, the reality of the morning creeping in, and I will not be your kept woman hidden away in a townhouse in London. I will not hide you, Arthur vowed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I will figure this out. I have the power to reshape this world if I must. But as Clara looked into the dying fire, a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. He had burned the warrant, but he could not burn the truth. The debt collector had seen them. The servants would know. The world outside these walls was built on rules that crushed people like them. They had stolen this night, but the dawn was coming, and with it, the price of their theft. Arthur tightened his hold on her as if he could physically shield her from the future. But even a duke could not hold back the tide of scandal that was already rising unseen in the dark corridors of Ravenshire. The days following the storm were possessed of a suffocating sweetness, like fruit left too long in the sun on the verge of rot. The West Wing, once a place of dust and silence, had become a sanctuary of stolen breaths and clasped hands. Arthur and Clara moved through the hours of daylight like actors on a stage, performing their roles of master and servant with a rigid precision that fooled no one. The household staff, a collective organism with 1,000 eyes and ears, sensed the shift in the air. It was in the way the Duke no longer took his meals in the dining hall, preferring a tray in the library. It was in the way Clara walked, her head high, the haunting fear in her eyes replaced by a dangerous, luminous hope. But secrets in a manor like Ravenshire were not kept. they were merely hoarded until they could be spent as currency. The first blow fell not from outside but from within the bloodline. Lady Agatha, Arthur's aunt and the matriarch of the family in his mother's absence, arrived in a carriage drawn by 4 gray mares, her presence announcing the return of the rigid social order Arthur had been ignoring. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper words, draped in stiff bombazine and pearls that looked like teeth. Clara was summoned to the morning room 3 days after Lady Agatha's arrival. The room was bathed in cold, pale sunlight that offered no warmth. Lady Agatha sat by the window, a cup of tea untouched on the saucer before her. She did not look up when Clara entered and curtsied. "Do you know why the Duke has not remarried?" Lady Agatha asked, her voice light, conversational, as if discussing the weather. She picked up a silver spoon and stirred the tea, the metal chiming against the china like a warning bell. "I cannot say, my lady," Clara replied, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to hide their trembling. "Because he requires a match of dynastic significance," Agatha continued, finally turning her gaze upon Clara. Her eyes were pale blue, clouded with age but razor-sharp in scrutiny. "He requires a woman who brings land, title, and political alliances. He does not require distraction." Clara remained silent, her heart thudding against her ribs. "I'm not blind, girl," Agatha snapped, the conversational tone vanishing. "I see the way he looks at you. I see the time he spends in that library. You may believe you're special. You may believe that because you have a pretty face and can read a book you have transcended your station. But to him you are a symptom of his grief. A lapse in judgment. Men of his standing have appetites, and when they are grieving, they seek comfort in the lowest places because it requires no effort." The cruelty of the words struck Clara like a physical blow. She wanted to defend him, to speak of the vulnerability he had shown her, the way he held her as if she were the only anchor in a shifting sea. But she knew that to speak of it would only confirm the scandal. "I serve the Duke, my lady," Clara said, her voice hollow. "You threaten him," Agatha corrected, standing up. She was small, but she cast a long shadow. "Lord Harrington has been talking in London. He speaks of a maid at Ravenshire who behaves like a mistress. He speaks of a duke who pays off the debts of a disgraced gambler's daughter. Yes, we know about your father. The check Arthur wrote to that debt collector, it was drawn from the estate accounts. It is traceable." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "If this continues," Agatha hissed, stepping closer, "Arthur will lose his standing in the House of Lords. His political enemies are looking for a weakness. You are that weakness. If you truly care for him, you will excise yourself from his life before you rot the limb entirely." Clara was dismissed with a wave of a hand. She stumbled out of the morning room, the world tilting on its axis. The joy of the last fortnight curdled into ash. She had thought their love was a private revolution, a small defiance against the world. She hadn't realized she was handing his enemies the knife to cut his throat. The second blow came that evening. Clara had been sent to the orangery to collect fresh lemons for the kitchen, a task beneath her new station but one she accepted to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house. The glass structure was humid and fragrant, the air thick with the scent of citrus and damp earth. Shadows stretched long between the rows of trees. As she reached for a hanging fruit, a hand clamped over her wrist. She spun around, a scream dying in her throat as she recognized the bloated, sneering face of Lord Harrington. He had not gone to the continent. He had been waiting, circling the estate like a vulture waiting for the carcass to ripen. "I told you I would collect," Harrington whispered, twisting her arm behind her back and forcing her against the rough bark of a lemon tree. "The Duke exiled you," Clara gasped, pain shooting through her shoulder, "if he finds you here." "If he finds me here, he will kill me," Harrington agreed with a manic grin. "And then he will hang for the murder of a peer. Is that what you want, to see your precious Duke swinging from a rope at Newgate?" He leaned in close, the smell of stale wine on his breath making her gag. "I have the debt collector, Clara." Mr. Leach was quite talkative after a few pints of gin. "I have a signed affidavit stating that the Duke of Ravenshire paid £3,000 to silence a warrant for his mistress. Bribery, corruption, misuse of funds, it's enough to strip him of his lord lieutenancy. It's enough to make him a pariah." "What do you want?" Clara spat, tears of rage and fear stinging her eyes. "I want what he has," Harrington snarled, his eyes dropping to her bodice. "I want to break the thing he loves. You will leave him, Clara, tonight. You will come to my carriage at the North Gate at midnight. You will become my mistress, and you will do it willingly. If you refuse, or if you tell him of this conversation, I will release the affidavit to the London Gazette tomorrow morning. Arthur will be ruined, his name will be mud, his legacy will be destroyed." He released her abruptly, shoving her away. Midnight Clara, do not test me. Harrington melted back into the shadows of the garden, leaving Clara gasping for air, the scent of lemons now sickly and cloying. She ran back to the manor, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of terror. She could not tell Arthur. If she told him, he would hunt Harrington down. He would violently assault or kill the man. Arthur had nearly done it for a mere insult. For blackmail, his rage would be absolute. And Harrington was right. If Arthur killed a peer, even in defense of her honor, the law would not save him. The noose would wait for him just as surely as ruin waited for his reputation. She reached the west wing, breathless and disheveled. Arthur was not in the library. He was meeting with his bailiff. Clara stood in the center of the room, looking at the desk where they had first made love, looking at the chair where he had sat and told her he was hollow. She realized then that Lady Agatha was right. She was the weakness. As long as she remained, Arthur was vulnerable. He would burn the world down for her. She knew that now. He would destroy his own life to protect her. The only way to save him was to remove the cause of the fire. She moved with the mechanical numbness of the condemned. She went to the small room adjacent to the library where she had been sleeping. She did not pack her dresses. She did not take the jewels he had tried to give her. She took only her rough linen shift, her heavy cloak, and the locket that held a miniature of her mother, the only thing she had left of her former life. She sat at the small writing desk and dipped a quill into the ink. Her hand shook so violently she dropped the pen twice before she could write. My dearest Arthur, you once told me that you were a monster of duty. You were wrong. You are a man of honor in a world that has none, but I cannot be the stone that drags you to the bottom of the river. The world will not let us be. They will use me to destroy you, and I love you too much to watch you fall. Do not come for me. If you follow, you prove them right. Let me go and save yourself. Yours in this life and the next, Clara. She left the letter on his desk, weighted down by his silver signet ring which he had left there earlier. The sight of the ring, the symbol of his power and his burden, nearly broke her resolve. She pressed a kiss to the cold metal, tasting salt, and turned away. The house was quiet as she slipped out through the servants' passages. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 11. She had an hour before Harrington expected her at the north gate, but she had no intention of meeting him. She would take the footpath through the woods toward the village coaching inn. She would catch the mail coach to the coast. She would disappear into the anonymity of the world, far away from dukes and blackmail and the crushing weight of love. The night was cold, a biting frost settling on the grass. Clara walked fast, her cloak pulled tight around her, the gravel of the drive crunching softly beneath her boots. She reached the edge of the woods, the darkness of the trees yawning like a mouth. Going somewhere. The voice did not come from Harrington, it came from the shadows of the portico she had just passed. Clara froze, she turned slowly. Arthur stepped out from the darkness. He was still dressed in his evening clothes, the black velvet absorbing the moonlight, making his face appear starkly pale. He held a piece of paper in his hand, her letter. Arthur, she whispered, the name fracturing in the cold air, please go back. You write a beautiful letter, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He walked towards her, his movements fluid and predatory, full of noble sacrifice, full of lies. It is not a lie, she pleaded, backing away as he advanced. Harrington, Agatha, they will destroy you, Arthur. They know about the money, they know about us. I am ruining you. Did you think I did not know? Arthur stopped a few feet from her. He crumpled the letter in his fist, the paper crackling. Did you think I was unaware of my aunt's venom? Did you think I did not know Harrington was lurking on my grounds like a rat? If you know, then let me go, she cried, tears freezing on her cheeks. If I stay, you lose everything, your title, your standing, your legacy. I cannot be the reason you lose it all. You are not listening, Clara, Arthur said. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, grabbing her arms. His grip was iron, inescapable. I do not care about the title, I do not care about the standing. I have spent 10 years being the Duke of Ravenshire, and it has brought me nothing but cold ash and duty. You are the fire, do you understand? You are the only thing that is real. But they will ruin you, she sobbed, beating her fists against his chest. Harrington will expose the debt, he will make you a laughingstock, you will be an outcast. Let him try, Arthur snarled, shaking her slightly to make her look at him. His eyes were wild, blazing with a ferocity she had never seen. Let him publish his affidavits. Let my aunt clutch her pearls. I will burn this entire estate to the ground before I let you walk out of that gate. I will tear down the house of Lords stone by stone if they try to take you from me. Arthur, that is madness, she whispered. It is love, he corrected, his voice dropping to a raw, desperate growl. And it is the same thing. I have lived without it for a lifetime. I will not go back to the dark, Clara, I will not. He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her so tightly it was hard to breathe. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, shaking with the force of his emotion. But Harrington, Clara mumbled into his coat, he is waiting at the north gate. He expects me to surrender to him. Arthur went still, the trembling ceased, replaced by a deadly rigidity. He pulled back, holding her face in his hands. His expression had shifted from desperate lover to something ancient and violent. He is waiting for you, Arthur asked softly. Yes, Clara breathed, at midnight. Arthur looked towards the north gate, invisible through the trees. A cold, cruel smile touched his lips, a smile that promised violence. Then we should not keep him waiting, Arthur said. Go back to the house, Clara, lock the door to the west wing, let no one in. What are you going to do? She asked, fear spiking in her chest. I am going to end this, he said. I am going to show Lord Harrington the price of threatening what is mine. Arthur, no, she grabbed his lapels. If you kill him, you are lost. I will not kill him, Arthur said, his eyes glittering like shards of ice. Death is too quick for a man like that. I am going to take everything from him. I am going to leave him with nothing but his name, and I will make that name a curse. He kissed her hard, a bruising, possessive seal on his promise. Go now. Clara hesitated, then turned and ran back towards the house, her heart pounding in rhythm with her footsteps. She looked back once to see Arthur standing at the edge of the woods, a dark sentinel against the night. He turned and began to walk towards the north gate, not with the haste of a man rushing to a fight, but with the slow, terrifying inevitability of an executioner approaching the block. The promise had been made, now the price would be paid, and the reckoning would stain the white snow of Ravenshire red. The north gate of Ravenshire Manor was a desolate threshold, a wrought iron mouth yawning open to the biting wind of the moors. At midnight, the world was reduced to shades of charcoal and silver, the moonlight struggling to penetrate the thick, rolling fog that clung to the earth like a burial shroud. Lord Harrington waited by his carriage, his breath plumbing in the icy air, tapping a cane against the wheel with a rhythmic, impatient arrogance. He checked his pocket watch for the third time, the gold casing glinting in the gloom. He expected a terrified girl, broken by the threat of ruin, clutching a meager bundle of belongings and ready to surrender her dignity for her lover's reputation. He smiled to himself, a greasy tightening of his jaw savoring the victory. He had always hated Ravenshire, hated his effortless power, his brooding superiority. Breaking the Duke's favorite toy was merely a bonus. The real prize was knowing he had forced the great Arthur to his knees by proxy. But the footsteps that crunched against the gravel were not light and hesitant. They were heavy, deliberate, and solitary. Harrington squinted into the fog. The figure emerging from the mist was not a woman. It was a silhouette of broad shoulders and a long, sweeping coat, moving with the terrifying inevitability of a storm front. Arthur stopped 10 paces away, the silence of the moors amplifying the menace of his presence. He wore no hat, his dark hair damp with the mist, his face a pale, impassive mask carved from marble. He did not look like a man who had come to beg. He looked like a man who had come to pass sentence. You seem disappointed, Harrington, Arthur said, his voice low and devoid of inflection, cutting through the wind. Were you expecting someone softer? Harrington straightened, trying to summon the bluster that usually served him so well in the gaming hells of London. He took a step back, his hand tightening on his cane. Where is she, Arthur? I made my terms quite clear. If the girl is not in this carriage by midnight, the affidavit goes to the Gazette. You will be finished, stripped of your lieutenancy. Pariah. Yes, Arthur agreed, taking a slow step forward. The affidavit, a fascinating document, it details how I paid the debts of a Miss Clara Sterling to prevent her imprisonment. A scandalous misuse of funds, you claim, bribery, corruption. It is the truth, Harrington sneered, emboldened by the mention of his weapon, and the truth will destroy you. Arthur reached into his coat. Harrington flinched, perhaps expecting a pistol, but Arthur produced only a sheaf of papers bound in red tape. He tapped them against his open palm, the sound sharp and rhythmic. I have been busy this evening, Harrington. While you were lurking in my orangery, terrorizing my staff, I was communicating with my solicitors in the city via the telegraph office in the village. It is marvelous technology, truly. It allows one to purchase liabilities with the speed of thought. What are you talking about? Harrington demanded, a flicker of unease piercing his bravado. Your debts, Arthur said simply. You are a gambler, Harrington, and not a very good one. You owe £4,000 to the Golden Lion, £2,000 to the Vane Syndicate, and a staggering £5,000 against the mortgage of your estate in Kent. Arthur tossed the papers onto the frozen ground at Harrington's feet. I bought them, all of them. As of an hour ago, I am your sole creditor. Harrington stared at the papers, his face draining of blood. The wind caught the edges of the documents, fluttering them like dying birds. You threaten me with a scandal, Arthur continued, his voice dropping, becoming a rumble of thunder. A scandal is a temporary inconvenience. It is gossip, it fades. But debt is a shackle, Harrington, and I am a merciless jailer. If you release that affidavit, if you so much as whisper Clara's name, I will foreclose on your estate tomorrow. I will strip you of your lands, your horses, your home, and the very clothes on your back. I will have you thrown into the Fleet prison, and I will ensure you rot there until the end of your days. Harrington fell back against his carriage, his knees buckling. The leverage he thought he held had disintegrated, replaced by a guillotine blade hovering over his own neck. He looked at Arthur and saw not a rival peer but a titan who had simply outspent and outmaneuvered him. The Duke had not used violence, he had used the crushing weight of his empire to swat Harrington like a fly. You would ruin a peer for a servant, Harrington whispered, his voice trembling. She is not a servant, Arthur said, the coldness in his eyes finally flaring into a white-hot protectiveness. She is the woman I love, and if you ever come within 100 miles of her again, I will not rely on solicitors. I will kill you myself, and I will sleep soundly afterwards. Now get in your carriage, leave my county. If you are not gone by sunrise, the foreclosure begins. Harrington scrambled into his carriage without another word, shouting at his driver to whip the horses. The vehicle lurched forward, clattering away into the fog, a desperate retreat of a beaten cur. Arthur stood alone at the gate, watching the taillights fade. He felt no triumph, only a profound exhaustion and a clarity that rang through him like a bell. He had burned the bridge to his old life. He had used his power not to uphold the rigid structures of his class, but to dismantle the threat to the one person who made him feel human. He turned his back on the dark moors and began the long walk back to the house, towards the light that flickered in the west wing window. The library was warm, but Clara was shivering. She sat in the high-backed chair, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the door. Every creak of the manor's settling timbers sounded like a gunshot, every gust of wind sounded like a scream. She had spent the last hour in a purgatory of imagination, visualizing Arthur dead in the snow or Harrington dragging her away in chains. When the door handle finally turned, she stopped breathing. Arthur entered. He brought the cold in with him, the scent of frost and damp wool clinging to his coat. He looked tired, his hair disheveled, mud splattered on his boots, but he was whole. There was no blood on his hands. Arthur, she breathed, standing up, her legs shaking. He did not speak. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her with a desperation that told her everything. He was shaking, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving his body. He is gone, Arthur murmured against her skin. He will never trouble you again. The debt is settled. His silence is insured. What did you do? Clara asked, pulling back to search his face, fearing the worst. Did you? I did not kill him, Arthur assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. I merely reminded him that while he plays with cards, I play with lives. I bought his debts, Clara. I own him. He is powerless. Clara let out a sob of relief, sagging against him, but as the immediate fear subsided, the secondary reality set in. The danger from Harrington was gone, but the house was still full of eyes. Lady Agatha was still upstairs. The world was still the world. But what now? Clara whispered. Harrington is gone, but the truth remains. I am a maid, Arthur. You are a duke, Lady Agatha said. Lady Agatha does not rule this house, Arthur said, his voice hardening again, though his touch remained gentle. I do, and I am done with hiding. I am done with shame. The following morning brought the true reckoning. It took place not on a dark moor, but in the sunlit brutality of the breakfast room. Lady Agatha was already seated, buttering a slice of toast with aggressive precision when Arthur entered. He was not wearing his riding clothes. He was dressed in his formal morning coat, his signet ring polished, every inch the Duke. Clara walked beside him. She wore a simple dress of blue wool, not a uniform, but not the silk of a lady. Her head was high, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Agatha froze, the knife hovering over the toast. Her eyes darted from Arthur to Clara, and her lips thinned into a line of white disapproval. Arthur, she said, her voice dripping with ice. I assume there is a reason the library maid is accompanying you to breakfast. Has the service in this house collapsed entirely? Clara is not here to serve, Aunt, Arthur said, pulling out a chair for Clara at his right hand, the place of honor. Clara sat, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of Agatha's glare like a physical burn. She is here to dine. Agatha dropped the knife. It clattered against the china. This is an absurdity. Have you lost your mind? Harrington has been spreading filth about this girl, and instead of dismissing her, you parade her at my table? Think of your reputation, Arthur. Think of the family name. I am thinking of it, Arthur said calmly, pouring tea for Clara himself, a gesture that made the footman in the corner stiffen with shock. The family name has become a tomb, Agatha. It is a monument to duty and loveless marriages in cold, empty rooms. I am done with it. You cannot mean to keep her, Agatha hissed, standing up, her hands trembling with rage. As a mistress, you would bring a whore into your mother's dining room. Careful, Arthur said. The word was soft, but it stopped Agatha cold. He looked at her with eyes that were ancient and unyielding. You will speak of her with respect, or you will leave this house and never return. Clara is not my mistress. She is the daughter of a gentleman, though that matters little to me. She is the woman who saved me from becoming a ghost in my own home. He reached out and took Clara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers atop the white tablecloth. The contrast of his signet ring against her plain hand was stark, a visual declaration of war against convention. I intend to marry her, Arthur announced. The silence that filled the room was absolute. The footman dropped a napkin. Agatha paled, clutching the back of her chair for support. Clara turned to look at him, her eyes wide with shock. They had not discussed marriage. Protection, yes. Love, yes. But marriage, it was impossible. It was social suicide. You cannot, Agatha whispered. The king, the peerage, they will shun you. You will be laughed out of London. Let them laugh, Arthur said, his voice ringing with a newfound freedom. I have enough land to build a new world and enough wealth to buy silence until they get used to it. I do not need London. I do not need the approval of people who only value me for my title. I need her. He looked at Clara then, ignoring his aunt entirely. I know it is a heavy thing to ask, he said softly, his thumb sweeping over her knuckles. To ask you to bear the weight of the scandal, to ask you to be a duchess when you only wanted to be free, but I cannot be the man I want to be without you. Will you stand with me, Clara? Will you help me rewrite the rules of this place? Clara looked at the man who had burned a warrant for her, who had threatened a lord for her, and who was now dismantling his entire life for her. She saw the fear in his eyes, not fear of society, but fear that she might say no. She realized then that the power had never really been his. It had been hers. He was offering her his world, not as a gift, but as a plea. I will, Clara whispered, her voice steady. I will stand with you, Arthur, against them all. Arthur smiled, and it was not the guarded, cynical smile of the Duke, but the open, radiant smile of a man who had finally found the sun. Epilogue 1 year later. The autumn air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and turning leaves. The gardens of Ravenshire Manor had changed. The rigid geometric hedges that had once defined the landscape were softer now, overgrown with climbing roses and wildflowers that spilled over the stone paths. The windows of the west wing were thrown open, and the sound of a piano drifted out onto the terrace, a lively, stumbling melody, played by hands that were still learning. Arthur stood on the terrace, leaning against the stone balustrade, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He no longer wore black. His coat was a deep, rich blue, and the tension that had once defined his posture was gone. He looked like a man at peace. The music stopped, and a moment later, Clara stepped out onto the terrace. She wore a gown of heavy emerald silk, cut in the latest fashion, but her hair was loose, blowing freely in the wind. She carried a book in one hand and a half-eaten apple in the other, a breach of decorum that would have given Lady Agatha an apoplectic fit, had she not retreated to her dower house in Bath 6 months prior. The steward is looking for you, Clara said, coming to stand beside him. She took a bite of the apple, her eyes dancing with amusement. Something about the tenant cottages and a dispute over a fence. Pharaoh can handle it, Arthur said, turning to her. He reached out, taking the apple from her and placing it on the balustrade, then pulling her into his arms. I am currently occupied with more important matters. Oh, Clara raised an eyebrow, resting her hands on his chest. And what matters are those, your grace? Admiring my wife, he murmured, leaning down to kiss her, and contemplating the fact that for the first time in a century, Ravenshire feels like a home. It had not been easy. The scandal had been ferocious. The London papers had printed vicious cartoons, old friends had sent letters of cold regret. They had been isolated for months, living in a self-imposed exile within the estate, but Arthur had held true to his promise. He had used his intellect and his wealth to force the world to reckon with them. He improved the tenant farms, invested in the railways, and ignored the snubbing of the elite until the elite realized they needed his money more than they needed their pride. Slowly, the invitations had started to return. But they rarely accepted them. They had built something better here. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, looking out over the lands that were now hers to care for. She was no longer the handmaid who scrubbed the floors, but she never forgot the girl who had hidden in the study. That girl was the steel in the Duchess's spine. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly, a question she asked less often now, but one that still lingered. The isolation the friends lost. Arthur laughed, a low, warm sound that vibrated against her. "I regret nothing, Clara. I traded a room full of strangers for a life full of you. It was the greatest bargain I ever struck." He turned her in his arms so they were both facing the horizon where the first stars were beginning to prick the violet sky. The estate stretched out before them, no longer a monument to the dead, but a living, breathing kingdom. "Let them talk," Arthur whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Let them whisper in their ballrooms. We have the stars, Clara, and we have each other." Clara smiled, leaning back into his warmth as the wind swept over the moors. The darkness was coming, but for the first time in the history of Ravenshire there was no fear of the night. Inside the manor, the fires were lit, the library was waiting, and the Duke and his handmaid were finally, irrevocably home.